right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Today we're going to start the final section of this unit on the nervous system. And if you take a look, we're going to take the combination of chapter 48, 49, and 50. So really what I'm going to do is pull out pieces from each of these chapters that are truly relevant to the AP exam, as well as to those of you who may be seeking interest in some sort of medical professional in the future. So we're not necessarily going to cover each of these chapters completely, but we're going to combine information from each of these chapters as is relevant to our discussion on self-communication. So what I'd like to start with is kind of a place that we've started with a couple of sections this year, and that's really to talk about overall system organization as a nervous system exists in organisms, and really talk about that organization and how it has evolved in different species that we see throughout animal kingdoms. So every organism, whether we're talking about a single-celled organism or multicellular organism, has to be able to respond to stimuli in its environment. That really is one of the key pieces to defining what life is. So when we look at multicellular organisms, most of these animals are doing the response to that stimuli using a system of neurons. So the nervous system's organization usually correlates to the lifestyle of that organism. The more simplistic the organism, more often than not, the more simplistic their nervous system. So if we look at something as simple as the hydra here, these are little cnidarians. They're, I don't know, I'd say a few centimeters at most tall. These are little aquatic organisms. They kind of hang out on hard surfaces in the oceans, and they really don't have a true nervous system like we're used to about thinking. There's no brain. Instead, they have this just nerve net. It's a series of interconnected nerve cells that allows them to take information from their environment, spread that information out to other parts of their body to elicit certain responses as necessary. So this really is probably the most simplistic nervous system organization that we have an example of in current living species. When we truly talk about nerves, we're talking about bundles that consist of axons of multiple nerves. And if you don't know what an axon is, sit tight. We'll get to the structure of a nerve in more detail later. But we're talking about these nerve nets, and these aren't true neurons as we're going to talk about them as things progress. It takes us until we get to something a little bit more complicated, like these sea stars, to take that nerve net and now bundle it together into a true nerve. And what we see in these sea stars is, although they don't have a brain, they do have a sort of a nerve ring there in the center, and then they've got radial nerves that spread out into each of their arms from there. So we're getting a little bit more complex as this sort of neural system starts evolving. We get to bilaterally symmetrical animals, and all of a sudden we start exhibiting this idea of cephalization. What does that mean? That means that we now are starting to get some sort of very rudimentary brain structure, this clustering of sensory organs at the front of the body. So if we look at things like planaria or these leeches, these guys have incredibly simplistic cephalization setups, but they do have, by definition, a central nervous system. They've got a simplistic brain, they've got nerve cords, and they've got nerves that then branch off of that cord itself. So if you take a look here in my planaria, right here, they've got a brain. They've got two nerve cords in them, and then they've got these transverse nerves that break off of that branch. In the leech here, brain up front, they have a single ventral cord, a little more like what we're used to, and then they've got branching ganglia that come off from there. So we go from basically just radial signaling to a little bit more centralization to now having truly that brain structure, although very simplistic compared to something we would expect to see in us as humans. We're starting to progress to a bit more complex system. Your annelids and arthropods, these guys have segmented arrangements of clusters of neurons that we call ganglia. So here again, they do have that cephalization. They've got that ventral nerve cord, and now the nerves that are branching off from there then do also have this segmented, excuse me, ganglia. So they're starting to branch from branches. So the branching structure is getting more complicated as we go. Uh, Muscles, things like clams, these guys that kind of don't really move, they kind of just hang out, also have some pretty simplistic systems. No true brain, but they do have something that looks a little bit more like the sea stars in the fact that they do have a neural ring, and it is also more cephally located, so front located. And then they've got longitudinal cords branching off from there. We look at your more complex mollusks, things like octopi and squids. These guys are considerably more intelligent just based on the way that their system works. They also have some more sophisticated systems as a result. So they do have a true brain, and then they do break off from there into nerve cords and ganglia as well.